Liz acquired some water and food for her daughter from a table loaded with pallets of the stuff. The child consumed it all greedily, as did Liz herself. Despite its small internal volume, Liz managed to stuff 4 further bottles into her bag. Nobody told her off, and most people were doing the same. A recorded message played over the platform's public address system instructed them to prepare to board the train based on the color coding they had been given. Each cattle car could be identified by one of the colors Liz could see adorning people's necks. This terrified her, partly because she was Jewish. She had a strong feeling her ancestors had been in this situation before. There seemed to be no sense to this, and no choice either. They had been forced to come here under the umbrella of it being for their safety, and now she was seriously beginning to question the validity of that. Had she brought Ruby into harm's way? It was something else for her to feel guilty about, even though really she hadn't been given any kind of choice. She supposed they could have tried to hide, but then what would they have done? It would have been foolish to stay in Portland with a vampiric horde marching on the city's perimeter. Anyone left in the city would be hunted down and gorged on by ravenous beasts who cared not for compassion or mercy. It was also clear that they were checking everyone off a pre-prepared list. Liz had no idea how the list had been compiled, but if their names came up missing, she had no doubt people would be sent out to hunt for them. There were so many things about this that concerned her, but perhaps the thing that stuck out the most was the way the men weren't mingling with them. Sure, Liz had interacted with a female soldier, but not a single male face had been on display since the sirens earlier in the day. "Time for boarding," the tannoy voice ordered. With a uniform action, 5 of the doors on the train opened sideways, giving a glimpse of the interior. For some reason, Liz expected to see straw-laden floors, but the carriage's interiors were white and pristine. Those assorted on the platform began to move forward, helping each other up onto the train. When it became Liz's turn, she reluctantly helped her daughter board. By the time she was in herself, the train car was already half full. Liz couldn't fathom why there were no seats. It was standing room only. At least there was evidence of air conditioning, so they had that going for them. Were there so many people that the army felt this was the only way to move them? Claustrophobia threatened to engulf her, but she had to swallow that up for the sake of her daughter. Employing the same technique as before, Liz moved over to the side of the carriage, managing to work her way into a corner. The floor underneath was perforated, probably to allow liquid to flow away. The interior was painted white, halogens illuminating the whole sorry display. There were metal loops along the walls at regular intervals, and Liz found herself wondering where these train compartments had come from. Liz hoped the train ride wouldn't be long because there wouldn't be room here for people to lie down. As more people forced their way in, it became evident that they wouldn't be able to sit either. The smells of the assorted travelers assaulted her nostrils. It wasn't just body odor she smelt, but terror as well. That terror amplified considerably when the doors to this new prison closed. Within seconds, the lights went out. They had taken Liz, and now chaos surrounded her. Liz had done her best to keep to the edge of the crowd, not wanting to be swallowed up by the desperate masses. In her right hand, she clutched the tiny digits of her 10-year-old daughter. In her left, she clung to the chain-link fence that had been erected to help funnel the panic toward the waiting trains. The trains screamed hope. They screamed rescue. They hadn't let her bring a suitcase or a rucksack. The small shoulder bag with her most valuable possessions was the only thing she had been allowed. Ruby, her daughter, held tenaciously onto the teddy bear, the last semblance of a childhood that had been ripped from her. Hundreds of people were here, moving steadily forward, with only one direction now allowed for them. Even if she had wanted to turn back, the push behind Liz would have prevented it. There was barely any room to breathe in the throng that pulsed with the prospect of instant insanity. If not for the soldiers guarding the perimeter, madness might have taken them, dozens being trampled to the ground. The trick was to look forward and keep moving. One thing she noticed very quickly was that, with the exception of the soldiers, there were no men here. Most were off fighting on the front lines against the plague, but there should have been old men, or even boys. If there were, Liz couldn't see them. This was a female exodus taken against many people's better judgment. Portland had been designated a safe city, and then suddenly it wasn't. One day they were being told how the army was winning the battle against the forces brought into being by the virus, and the next they were being told to flee. They had no choice in the matter. Men with guns and NBC suits were going house to house, loading those unlucky enough to escape the virus onto trucks and buses. It was always men who did this. Throughout history, men had always used their strength to overpower those weaker than them, so there should be no surprises here. She couldn't deny the concern that welled in her that there were only females in the evacuating crowd. Women and children first was all well and good, but where were the boys? Even when they were being collected from their homes, they had been segregated by sex. If she had possessed a boy child, such separation would have torn her apart. Liz could feel the nightmare of that in the people around her. Liz looked down at the innocent and frightened face of her daughter Ruby. What could she say? Truth was, she didn't think anyone could be safe. Not now, and not in the world that was rapidly hurtling toward human extinction. The child needed hope. Something that Liz was in short supply of herself. All Liz could do was deflect and try and hide her own fear. As a mother, she couldn't give her child much except for her unconditional love and any strength that she had left. The tears began to leak out of the corners of Ruby's eyes once more. There had been a lot of that the last few days, her daughter both fearful and confused. Now there were no audible sobs, just a yawning pit of desolation that tore Liz's heart in two. What was there she could say? When they had been taken and forced to board the bus, Liz had seen what happened to those who defied the will of the soldiers. These hardened men, with their faces hidden by the mandatory respirators, would accept no compromise in the order they demanded. The butts of their guns were used as improvised clubs, skulls cracked as a reward for any sign of rebellion. They never hit the women, though. Only the remaining men who had been too young, too old, or too sick to join the fight against the virals. "Keep moving," demanded a soldier with a megaphone. He stood out of the top of an army Humvee, his face obscured by apparatus. The instruction wasn't needed. Nobody in the crowd around Liz wanted to be here. This city, Liz's home since her birth, would soon be overrun by the horrors surging toward its boundaries. They had been told that the virals were mere hours away. Their only hope was the trains they were now all being ferried to. "Keep moving so you can board the trains. The trains will take you to safety." Liz wanted to believe that. She really did. So why didn't she? She felt she was being steamrollered, with no opportunity to question what was happening. The doubts probably surfaced because the men were acting so distant and cold. There should have been some compassion in their hearts, if not for the women, then at least for the children. All Liz could detect was determination and veins filled with ice. What had these men seen to make them this way? Their harshness defied the humanity that should have been there. Liz felt an elbow strike her arm as she was buffeted by the festering panic that surged through the crush of people. She pulled her child in front of her, wary of how vulnerable the young girl was. If her husband was still alive, things might have been different. But John had died early on, fighting on the front line. That was what they had told her, at least. The letter pushed silently through her door, the only notice she was given. Nobody came to deliver the news in person. That would have been impractical with the numbers dying in a war that would very shortly have an end. She still felt anger and guilt about how he had been forced to do his duty to country, rather than be here now to care for the ones who really mattered. How could she be expected to raise a child in this world alone? It wasn't fair, and the crowd pulsed with its own resentment, mingled with the hope that salvation awaited them on the trains. For many, this was the last chance to keep their sanity. "Keep moving forward to be processed," the voice announced over the bullhorn. There were lights shining down on Liz, with no inch of the contained area in any kind of darkness, despite the night sky. Her feet shuffled forward, the fences starting to converge toward a series of gates where more armed men waited. It felt like she had been here for hours, her bladder building its pressure that would soon override her conscious will. There were a lot of such smells surrounding her now, all of which added to the sense of building terror that needed some way to vent. The gates ahead were the release valve. The people filtered through at an unacceptable speed. Liz briefly caressed her child's long blonde hair. She would have given the child something to drink, but the one bottle she had brought had already been consumed. "Keep moving!" the booming voice came again. "Just shut up, damn you!" Liz wanted to scream. "Food and water will be provided once you are through processing." Processing? Why did they need to be processed? Liz took another few steps, the front of the queue now visible. There were 4 gates, each guarded by 2 men. Behind the gates were thinner wire tunnels where only a single person could venture through. This nonsensical design was holding everything up. Surely there was an easier way to get them onto the trains. Millions of people managed to commute to work that way every day. There was no other way to save them, right? Someone shouted off to her right. Liz's eyes were drawn to a just visible randomness in the crowd. Another, more colorful word was used, and then the crowd swallowed up whatever altercation had occurred. The gates finally revealed themselves. The guards were still on the other side of the wire, none of them in reach of a woman or child that might have been brought to the edge of madness. Although guns weren't being pointed, they were being held in a way that could have been perceived as threatening. Women in front of her tried to engage the soldiers, clearly aiming to gain some insight as to what was in store for them. No response ever came, the men stoic and unflinching in their silent vigil. The gates were basically just turnstiles, which meant that only one person could progress at a time. Each one had 2 lights. Green meant you could proceed, while red meant you had to wait. This had all been installed ready for the women's arrival, and another nugget of doubt grew in Liz's mind. If only she had listened to John instead of being swallowed up by her own doubts. There was a frightening moment when they reached the barrier. Ruby passed through with her mother's encouragement, but the light then remained red for several seconds. Liz caught the harried glance from her daughter, the uncertainty now spiraling the girl to a full-blown breakdown. But then the light changed, and Liz was able to walk through the metal arms to once again hold Ruby's shoulders. The 2 passed along the metal wire tunnel and were forced to join a line that ran parallel to half a dozen others. So this was processing, the numerous signs that were littered around the place giving the same instructions. Present your identification for inspection. They moved forward. Liz and Ruby now stood in front of a table, behind which sat a woman in soldier's uniform. She wore no form of facial protection, unlike the men who were visible. Still, the men were only seen on the outer side of the wire. Liz looked at the woman and saw the dark circles under her eyes. There was no life there, just benign resignation. And was there also fear? Surely she was just imagining that. Liz thrust forward her driver's license. The female soldier, whose name badge said Connor, grabbed it briefly. On the table in front of her, Connor religiously ran her finger down the screen on an iPad until she found Liz on the list. Connor asked for Ruby's name, sounding exasperated as she did so. Or was there something more there? Yes, there was. A secret that Connor wasn't ever going to reveal. Ruby Cartwright, Liz answered. Behind Connor, the train platform could be seen, dozens of people milling there. A train sat invitingly on the platform, but not the kind of train she would have expected. Were those cattle cars? Connor didn't ask for Ruby's identification, which was good because Liz didn't have any on her. There had only been time to bring the bare minimum once the soldiers had come knocking on her door. More words were spoken, and 2 plastic cards on lanyards were thrust at Liz, who took them robotically. The cards were color-coded, and Liz draped one over her daughter's neck. She assumed it was a good thing that they were both the same color. Stepping past the table, they joined a disjointed throng that wandered almost hypnotically toward the platform and the train that held such promise and such dread. There were soldiers on top of the train, walking up and down. Their presence should have been reassuring, but Liz found them totally menacing. There must have been 30 cattle cars making up the length of the train. With a sudden lurch, it moved forward, bringing more of the train's accessibility to the platform. Were they really going to be expected to travel in those? Things surely couldn't be that bad. The pressure in her bladder made itself known again, and Liz guided her daughter toward the blue portable lavatories that had been set up. Whoever had planned this had realized that toilet facilities would be required, and women were already forming up to get their chance. What would they do once they were on the train?